Today on Inside Utah Politics.
Making sense of the waning days of the 2024 election. We examine what both sides are doing to make their final appeals, what looks to be a tight race for the White House.
So tight. And what turnout can tell us about this? A third of all Utahns have their ballots in with just 2 days to go.
It's really demoralizing to see that this has happened.
And Utah's take on election security with ballot boxes torched in the Pacific Northwest. What's the safety protocol for counties in Utah?
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us on this final stretch before Election Day. I'm Brien McElhatten.
And I'm Jordan Tracy. Let's go inside Utah politics. We begin our show with the presidential election, now just 2 days away. And as far as the polls go, it seems it's a true toss-up that could come down to just a handful of votes.
So with that tension comes noise, heaps of polling and punditry that can often leave people confused and concerned. So we're hoping today to get down to brass tacks, if you will, understanding where the campaigns have placed their focus in these final days and hours that could decide everything.
That's right. Joining us today, we have Jason Perry. He is the director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah. Jason, welcome back to Inside Utah Politics.
Always good to be with you.
It's an exciting time.
It is an exciting time. And look, these candidates, I mean, they are making very loud speeches, right? The final rallies, both couching this as the most consequential election we've ever had and ever will have.
Oh, it's absolutely right. It's always the most consequential election. But these are the very important last hours. A lot of states like ours, the ballots have been out. They're trying to get them in. And when you have these races that are so close, and it's really about the turnout, you try to figure out a strategy where you can get the most number of people in the smallest amount of time. And that really is the strategy for these campaigns right now is, can I get people to vote, to show up to vote, turn in their ballots, and at least not give them a reason to vote against you? That's what they're trying to do.
What have you seen out of these final appeals, the final pitches out of both campaigns, and kind of how they've differed?
Well, so it's a difference of sort of surrogates is what I'm seeing right now, is you try to take advantage of gaffes where they happen, you know, and we've seen the Trump campaign trying to do that with some comments from President Biden a little bit too. He's driving around in a garbage truck. They're having big campaign rallies. They're trying to get, you know, the stars to show up. You know, Trump's trying to get Elon Musk, got a lot of Hollywood with Kamala Harris. It's really about trying to get your brand built through the brand of others. That's the big thing at these final days.
What are you going to look for when the polls close and the results coming in, particularly in an environment where there's disinformation and misinformation and people believe different things?
Yeah. We'll watch you two. All right, we'll listen to what you have to say.
Thank you. But that's a good answer.
Clip it. Post it on social media.
That really is the issue right now. And there is a lot of false information out there. And when you have groups with channels and the ability to sort of mislead, it's really important on that election night. In particular, you start watching those returns from legitimate places. You don't really give any credit to the allegations that come out too quickly or sort of the innuendo that things might not be right. You wait a little bit. You watch what's happening a little bit. Go to credible sources before you start really making any assumption about what really happened.
Now, obviously, everyone's looking at different things to try to predict what's going to happen. There was a poll in Arizona from Noble Predictive Insights that showed that Trump is a 1-point favorite in the state, but on enshrining abortion rights, 20% favorite in that case. So can the Harris campaign see that as a potential predictor that maybe they're going to do better than what the polls suggest?
Well, they can do that, you know, nationally for sure. In Utah, the polls seem to suggest we know where that's going. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, every time that President Trump has run for office in Utah, his numbers have gone up just a little bit. In the poll that we did just recently with the Deseret News, he was sitting somewhere around 61% inside the state of Utah. So there are issues, abortion being one of those nationally. It's a little less here in the state of Utah in terms of the driving force. Trump is probably going to take the state of Utah once again.
Nationally, some negative signs for Trump here. Maybe, I don't know. Since 1956, only one candidate with lower favorability has won, and that was Donald Trump, right? Yeah. So what are some of the challenges he's facing going into this?
Well, both of them are facing huge unfavorable numbers. Right. That's what's interesting is we go back to 2016. Even then, at the time, the two candidates were the most disliked in the history of the country. We have that now also. So what's interesting is when you have two people that are, people are saying, I don't like either one of my options. What do? You end up casting a vote against someone more than you cast a vote for someone. That's sort of the interesting issue right now, and both sides are trying to capitalize on that a little bit. But the reality is, even though they're polling at a certain number across the country and in the state of Utah, their unfavorables most of the time are higher than there are numbers of people who will be voting for them across the country. And it's a weird situation.
Yeah, and it seems like they're trying to grab that double negative voter who maybe, don't like Vice President Harris, don't like former President Trump, trying to see, how can we pull them over to dislike the other person more?
Yeah, that's what these campaigns try to do, for sure. And sadly, that is often the case. Who do you dislike the most as opposed to who do you love the most? And so you try to give people a reason to show up. They'll take the people who are the anti-vote, for sure. I mean, I'd rather you loved me, but it's okay that you just don't like my opponent. That's one thing. But this really is an important numbers game. Utah is one of them. But it really comes down to these really important battleground states in the country. There's 7 of them. And that's where you're going to see them concentrating most of their effort in the final days.
And not a lot of talk this cycle, like there was in 2016 and a little bit in 2020, about third-party candidates being a spoiler, because you saw RFK Jr. drop out, support the former president, but he is on the ballot in some states, like Michigan is one that he's still on the ballot.
Yeah, so it's in a small number of states. You're absolutely right, but not in enough states for it to be too much of an impact. You even saw in Utah at one point, remember Evan McMullen, when he was the third-party candidate? He got just over 21% in the state. So we know people are willing to consider a third-party candidate, but in this election right now for President of the United States, there isn't a third party. There isn't enough places to really move that needle very much.
Okay, talking about the numbers, what happens in the rare possibility here that there could be a tie in the Electoral College? What the heck happens?
Pandemonium, chaos.
I can't wait to find out is the answer.
That's going to be wild. We talked about the possibility, but likely not going to happen.
So not like and historically, for sure, that's the case. But a lot of what might happen here, if it gets to that point, is a little bit untested here. And we may start pulling our copies of the Constitution. We start talking to scholars, and we figure out what might happen. This one will come down to the wire. You said it right at the very beginning. For President of the United States right now, it is a coin toss. No one can legitimately say they've got this one figured out.
Let's talk a little bit of Beehive State politics, because what's been interesting in the cycle here in the Beehive State is the governor's race and having a popular challenger in the write-in campaign portion here. He was a popular Republican challenger, Phil Lyman. He won at the convention. How have you seen that kind of shift this race? Has it had any impact at all?
Yeah. Well, it has had some impact, yes. In our most recent poll, Spencer Cox was about 51%. You would see Republicans historically in the state be a little bit higher than that, and I'm going to put that up to exactly what you said. Most polls are not capturing Phil Lyman because he's not officially a candidate that would be on the ballot through the traditional process. He has filed all the right paperwork. He is a real write-in candidate, but it's really hard to poll that right there since he's not on that ballot. But without question, there are a few people out there that are with him in this one. So it's a curious case study for those of us who love politics. Write-in candidates aren't historically very successful. He's not going to be successful this time either. But by how much does he lose is going to be a very interesting question going forward.
And it has cast doubt.
Yeah.
On the process himself. There's a fracture in the GOP here in the state, right?
Well, so without question, there are a group of people out there that are completely with him, not just on the election process, but on the lieutenant governor's office who oversees elections in the state of Utah, even to the clerks, the county clerks that are in charge. He's going after quite a few of them, and we've seen some recently, that are maybe even with him on some of these arguments.
Yeah, it's definitely been interesting, and I feel like people are wondering, is there a chance? Maybe it's a pie-in-the-sky chance for maybe folks who support the Democratic candidate Brien King, that there's enough split off that maybe it gives him a shot. But do you see that?
So I don't think it's likely. I think it's most likely that Spencer Cox is going to be the governor again. But it was something to watch. Is how big are those numbers? What percentage does Phil Lyman get? Because his votes are largely going to be coming from Spencer Cox, not from Brien King. Brien King has been polling fairly well. He's a well-known member of our Utah State Legislature. So he's going to get maybe a larger number than we think. I think the outcome is still sort of certain, but it's instructive for anyone that comes later wanting one of these offices.
It has been such an interesting cycle with toss and turns. We had a joint ad of Phil Lyman and Brien King.
Right.
I don't think you would have saw that at the beginning of the cycle.
No, you wouldn't have, for sure. And I'm not sure we see that again in the future, but it's one of those very interesting things where you see people who are sort of you wouldn't expect to come together, which they did, and they both want to win, but they mostly want to take on Spencer Cox.
So no Lyman King podcasts in the future, you don't think?
Oh, yeah. Never say never.
I would listen to that. That would be interesting.
You'd watch that, right? Jason Perry, thank you so much for joining us again for Inside Utah Politics.
Glad to be with you.
Well, folks, still ahead on Inside Utah Politics, election security is top of mind. How Utah leaders are keeping your vote safe. Welcome back. Concerns over election security are growing, just as millions of Americans have already voted a week before Election Day. This after ballot drop boxes were set on fire in Arizona, Washington, and Oregon.
Election officials and law enforcement are now on high alert. We spoke with Salt Lake and Juab County clerks on the security measures in place and their reaction to those burning ballot boxes in other states.
I wish we were in a position where we could disagree better and realize that it's okay for everyone to have different opinions politically.
The FBI is now investigating fires set to ballot drop-off boxes in 3 states that one official called an act of terror. Here in Utah, county clerks are closely watching the situation.
Throughout Salt Lake County, I've worked with our law enforcement, with our sheriff's office, with our district attorney, to make sure that I am coming up with contingencies for Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, to ensure that we run a successful and smooth election, regardless of what happens.
They say they're also working with the Lieutenant Governor's office to make sure the right policies and plans are in place.
The Lieutenant Governor's office has been really proactive in giving us supplies and materials. So if we do get anything that we're concerned about in the mail, we have, some gloves or the extra supplies we need on anything that's suspicious or maybe would alarm us.
While we are primarily a vote-by-mail state, we additionally have vote centers where people can cast their ballot in person. If, heaven forbid, something happened that would not limit or diminish those people's ability to have their voice heard in this election.
But they say what happened over the past few days is demoralizing.
This is not the American way. The American way is for democracy to allow people who should have their voices heard to have that ability to have their voices heard.
I'd strongly encourage voters to go into your clerk's office and talk to them. Go into your election centers and see the process and watch the process and ask the questions.
Now, county clerks are asking Utahns to get their ballots in as soon as possible. That's especially true down in southern Utah, where election workers are hoping to avoid some of the issues they saw during this year's primary. Our southern Utah correspondent, Kanan Seacrest, has more.
From the post office to local drop boxes, both county officials and residents are sharing advice on securing your ballot this election season. For those planning to mail in their ballots, County Clerk and Auditor Ryan Sullivan says timing is key. Mailing too close to the election day can risk having your ballot go uncounted.
It's important that if you do choose to mail your ballot in, do it early. And if you're close to election day, I would really try and just find a drop box.
That's what happened to hundreds of southern Utahns during the primary election cycle. In Iron County alone, 415 ballots were postmarked too late, despite being mailed 2 days before the election. That's because many of southern Utah's mail-in ballots to this day have to be routed through the USPS Center in Las Vegas. So as we get closer to Election Day, it could be a better idea to drop off your ballot instead of leaving it in your mailbox.
I highly recommend taking your ballot into the post office and having the postal clerk hand stamp the ballot envelope with the postmark and make sure you can read it. If it's smeared, or have them restamp it before you turn it in.
Ryan also urges voters to consider using one of Washington County's 20 drop box locations, which he says provide a safe, reliable option. And neighbor Megan Staley has already made use of one.
I wanted to drop it off in person versus mailing it, so I would know for sure that it gets there. Sometimes the mail is undependable, and I wanted to make sure my vote counted.
For Megan, dropping off her ballot directly brings peace of mind, ensuring it reaches its destination without issue.
Yeah, that is a worry. you know, thinking that your vote might not count and it might get lost or someone might not deliver it on time and then your vote doesn't count. And this year we need all of our votes to count, and it's a very important election.
Washington County officials remind voters that the last day to accept mail-in ballots is November 4th, and if you're mailing it in close to that date, use a drop box or vote in person to ensure that your vote counts. Reporting in St. George, Cannon Sechrist, ABC4 News.
The Salt Lake County Council wants to tighten up rules on how elected officials can send out mailers when they're up for re-election. This comes in response to this flyer right here earlier this month. A Democratic County Recorder, Rochelle Hobbs, got some backlash for it, with some saying it constituted taxpayer-funded campaigning. She says she cleared the flyer with the district attorney and that it explains an important program. But to avoid this kind of thing from happening in the future, the Salt Lake County Council is considering new rules that would require future flyers to use the county's seal instead of a candidate's photo, and it would limit the font size of a candidate's name.
It's unfortunate that we're having to kind of nitpick and put together an ordinance, but I think in order to be transparent to the public, in order to make sure our tax dollars are spent wisely, I think it's prudent to do so.
Well, this was the first reading on that motion. They'll bring it up again during the next meeting before passage. We'll let you know.
We also want to let you know about our plans for election night. Our first newscast on November 5th will be at 3 p.m. when Judy Justice is normally on. We'll come back on the air at 4 p.m. until ABC News takes over coverage at 4:30. We'll work together to bring you national and local election headlines throughout the night until we come back on the air at 10 for wall-to-wall local election coverage. After the polls close here in Utah, we'll go live on ABC4.com with the latest results at 8 p.m. and then again at 9. ABC4 is, of course, your local election headquarters.
Yes, it is. And coming up, hearing what turnout is telling us. What can we learn from the numbers election officials are already making public? We'll tell you when we come back.
You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Welcome back to Inside Utah Politics. We're turning our eyes now to turnout.
Yes, we are. The deceptively nonpartisan election data could give us some insight into what to expect when results begin coming in. So breaking things down for us, we're joined by Jay Dessart. He's the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Utah Valley University. Thanks for being with us, Jay. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay. It's almost election day.
No kidding. I had no idea this was happening.
Has anybody been following this thing?
The media is not talking about it.
No one's talking enough about this election.
Yeah, right.
So look, like a third of Utah voters have cast their votes already. What are we on pace for in terms of turnout this year?
It's hard to say. I suspect it will probably be similar to what we had in 2020, if not higher. In 2020, we had the pandemic, which kind of ground a lot of things to a halt, but we still had record turnout under those circumstances. So I expect that it's entirely possible we'll have higher turnout this time around than we did in 2020.
Because both campaigns have been saying the stakes have never been greater. This is so consequential. I mean, how much of that is bluster and how much of that is true?
Well, I think a lot of people feel that way. And so what motivated people to vote in 2020 has not gone away. So I expect we'll probably see comparable turnout this time around.
How much, can you take stock into 2020 as an example, as setting a precedent when it was such an unprecedented cycle?
Well, that's true. It's hard to say just exactly what unique characteristics of 2020 will translate into 2024. But I see this as a very similar circumstance, despite the fact that now we're past COVID.
We're at this point where everyone is looking at polls like a horse race. It's like, well, today Harris won, tomorrow Trump's winning. And how much can you take stock in the polling at this point? What are campaigns looking at specifically when it comes to these returns on polls?
It's really hard to say. I think things have been cemented so solidly leading up to this point that the minor movements we see in the polls are really hard to or really easy to overinterpret. I don't see much movement happening now. There was a a surge after Harris came into the race for her, but things have kind of settled back down to pre-Harris levels, and so it's really hard to say.
Well, there's skepticism in polling, too. People say, oh, you know, the polls, you can't trust them. They're worthless.
Trump is underpolled.
Exactly. What do you say to that?
Well, you have to take it. You have to take a look at it from a broader perspective. Yes, there have been polling misfires in the past, but most of those polling misfires, particularly in 2016, were at the state level rather than at the national levels. The national level polls actually pretty much nailed the outcome, both in 2016 and 2020. The closer you got to Election Day, which is really what you should be looking at, is, you know, the polls 2 months ago, 3 months ago aren't going to tell you much, but today's polls are really going to give you a much better indication of how things are going to turn out on Tuesday.
There was also a lot of skepticism after 2020, which seems like forever ago, right? But there was skepticism over mail-in voting. A lot of conservatives all of a sudden adopted this narrative of it's bad, don't do it,
right,
vote in person or whatnot. Do you think that will have an effect on the results turnout this year?
We haven't heard much about the mail-in voting like we did in 2020. So it's hard to say if that's going to be the controversy again this time around. I think where there potentially could be some confusion and some controversy is the timing of when in-person voting comes out versus mail-in voting comes out. A lot of states will start reporting their results for the in-person voting after the mail-in voting comes out. And so we might see some shifting in terms of when those reports come out. If there's, like we saw in 2020, a significant difference between who votes in person and who votes in mail-in voting, right?
And when it came to the results in 2020, we saw the change because of the way things were counted, and that launched a gazillion conspiracy theories that are still floating around today.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was referred to as the blue shift, right? Yeah. And so if there's a difference in terms of who votes in which mode, that will ultimately be evident in when those results start being reported out. Absolutely, yeah. So we could very well see that same kind of thing happen this year.
For a state like Utah, where when it comes to national politics, you can kind of guess how it's going to go. How do you see turnout here in the Beehive State for an election that has been billed as consequential, when you know national politics maybe doesn't play that big of a role?
Yeah, it's hard to say with Utah. Once upon a time, Utah had one of the highest voter turnout rates in the country, and it has dropped significantly since then. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Utah is not a very competitive state typically. We'll probably still see turnout levels at 2020 levels or higher, I think, still, just because with our voting system, the mail-in voting, it tends to produce higher voter turnout because it's easier for people to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, how you feeling? We're taping this the Friday before Election Day. People are seeing this the Sunday before Election Day.
Yeah.
How you feeling about things?
It's all going to come down to Pennsylvania. It's that close.
Hey, it's your home state.
Listen, people say Pennsylvania is pretty important.
Yeah. No, it
produces a lot of results.
In my election model, it shows that Pennsylvania is the tipping point state. So whichever candidate wins Pennsylvania is going to win the White House. And right now, it's virtually a toss-up.
It is the Keystone State.
Yeah. It is, and I don't have any insight to tell you.
Okay.
I can't tell you what's going on there.
Okay.
Jay, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
You guys are doing some good work down there at UVU.
Well, thank you.
Excellent. Hey, stay with us, everybody. More Inside Utah Politics coming up right after this. Wow, that was a packed show.
I know.
Yeah, and that does it for today's edition of Inside Utah Politics. Don't forget, if you have any local political stories you'd like to see, make sure to reach out, would you? You can email InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow along with me on social media, on X at Brien Reports, on Instagram. Just search for Brien McElhatten.
As for me, you can find me on X at Jordan Tracy TV, and on Instagram, you can search Jordan Tracy.
He's far more entertaining, really, than I am. And find ABC4 on social media to follow along no matter where you are. And while you're at it, why don't you download the ABC4 News app? We are always on with headlines and breaking news.
We will see you again next week when we go inside Utah politics.